Hello, Jays Nation. Welcome back to your YouTube channel, the Toronto Blue Jays News Network. The Toronto Blue Jays have a serious problem on their hands, and surprisingly, it isn't Vladimir Guerrero Jr. With the playoff race heating up, Toronto's pitching staff is taking major hits. Injuries are piling up, and the margin for error is getting smaller by the day. But at the same time, the Blue Jays desperately need their $500 million superstar to rediscover the form that once made him one of the most feared hitters in baseball. So what exactly is going wrong in Toronto? And can Vladimir Guerrero Jr. turn things around before it's too late? Before starting the video, if you are a true Blue Jays fan, then don't miss this video and don't forget to subscribe our channel and like the video. The Toronto Blue Jays are facing a problem that could define the final stretch of their season. Toronto wants to get back to the postseason. The team wants another chance to make a deep October run. But right now, the Blue Jays are dealing with a combination of injuries, inconsistent pitching, and an offense that hasn't always delivered when the team has needed it most. And sitting right in the middle of that conversation is Vladimir Guerrero Jr. The superstar first baseman is not the only reason Toronto has struggled. In fact, the pitching situation may be the bigger concern. But when a franchise commits $500 million to a player, expectations become enormous. Every slump gets analyzed. Every quiet night at the plate becomes a headline. Every missed opportunity gets magnified. And that is exactly where the Blue Jays find themselves right now. Guerrero is supposed to be one of the faces of this franchise. He is supposed to be the player opponents fear when he walks into the batter's box. He is supposed to be the kind of hitter who can change the entire direction of a game with one swing. But this season has not consistently looked like that. And now Toronto has a decision to make. Does the organization continue treating Guerrero's struggles as an individual problem? Or does the entire team rally around its biggest star and help him rediscover the confidence, aggression, and consistency that made him one of baseball's most dangerous hitters? Because if Toronto wants to remain relevant in the playoff race, this cannot simply be about Vladimir Guerrero Jr. This has to be about the Blue Jays as a team. And there is another problem looming over everything. The pitching staff has taken serious hits. Injuries have created uncertainty. The rotation has been challenged. The bullpen has had to absorb pressure. And when your pitching staff is struggling to stay healthy, even a powerful offense can have difficulty surviving a long playoff race. That is why the Blue Jays are at a critical point. They need their pitchers to find ways to keep games under control. They need their offense to become more consistent. And they need Vladimir Guerrero Jr. to look like Vladimir Guerrero Jr. again. Not necessarily the player who has to hit 50 home runs. Not necessarily the player who has to carry the entire franchise, but the player who steps into the batter's box with confidence. The player who makes opposing pitchers uncomfortable. The player who looks capable of changing a game at any moment. That version of Guerrero could make Toronto a completely different team. The bigger problem in Toronto. Let's start with something important. It would be incredibly easy to look at Toronto's season and point directly at Vladimir Guerrero Jr. After all, when you're the face of a franchise and you're receiving a contract worth $500 million over 14 years, the spotlight is going to be enormous. That's unavoidable. But blaming everything on Guerrero would miss the bigger picture. The Blue Jays are dealing with a much broader problem. Their pitching situation has become one of the biggest obstacles standing between them and a potential postseason run. Baseball is a long season. Over 162 games, teams are going to experience injuries, slumps, hot streaks, and unexpected performances. But pitching depth is especially important. A team can survive an offensive slump. It can survive a hitter going through a difficult month. But when injuries start affecting the rotation and pitching staff, the consequences can spread throughout the entire roster. Suddenly, the bullpen has to cover more innings. Relievers are used more frequently. Starters are asked to pitch deeper into games. Young pitchers are placed under additional pressure, and the offense has less room for error. That is the situation Toronto has been trying to navigate. And it explains why the Blue Jays cannot simply say, Vladimir needs to hit better. The entire roster needs to improve. The organization needs better health. The pitching staff needs stability. The offense needs consistency. And the biggest stars need to perform when the pressure increases. That's what separates a team that simply competes from a team that actually makes noise in October. The Vladimir Guerrero Jr. expectation. There is no way around it. Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is one of the most important players in Toronto. The Blue Jays made that clear with their massive 14-year, $500 million commitment. That kind of contract isn't simply about past performance. It is about expectations for the future. Toronto believes Guerrero can be the centerpiece of the organization, the player the franchise builds around, the player young fans grow up watching, the player opposing teams prepare for, the player who can become synonymous with Blue Jays baseball. And that is why his struggles receive so much attention. When an ordinary player has a bad stretch, people move on. When a franchise superstar struggles, the entire conversation changes. Fans start asking questions. Analysts start examining statistics. Opposing teams notice. And suddenly, every at-bat becomes part of a much bigger story. But there is another side to this. Guerrero does not need to prove that he is talented. Everyone already knows that. The question is whether he can rediscover the version of himself that looks completely comfortable at the plate. That's the player Toronto needs. Because when Guerrero is locked in, the entire lineup feels different. Pitchers approach him differently. The hitters around him receive different opportunities. The opposing manager has to make different decisions. And the entire stadium can feel the difference. That's the power of a superstar. Why this cannot be only about Vladdy. Here is where Toronto has to be careful. If the Blue Jays turn Guerrero's struggles into a story about one player needing to save the season, they could make the problem worse. Baseball is not an individual sport. A hitter can go 4 for 4 and still lose. A pitcher can throw an outstanding game and still lose. A superstar can have an incredible night and still watch his team fall short. That's why Toronto needs a collective response. The clubhouse needs to understand that Guerrero is not expected to solve every problem. He doesn't need to carry the pitching staff. He doesn't need to score every run. He doesn't need to win every game. What he needs is support. And what the rest of the team needs is accountability. If Guerrero gets hot, the rest of the lineup needs to take advantage of the opportunities he creates. If the pitching staff holds an opponent to a few runs, the offense needs to give those pitchers support. If the bullpen is forced to cover additional innings, the starters need to find ways to go deeper into games. This is how teams survive difficult stretches. Not because one player suddenly becomes superhuman, but because everyone raises their level. The importance of confidence. One of the most overlooked elements in baseball is confidence. Hitting is extremely difficult. A hitter can be talented, experienced, disciplined, and physically prepared, and still go through a stretch where nothing seems to work. The ball looks different. Timing feels off. A pitch that normally looks hittable suddenly becomes difficult. A routine swing becomes complicated. And the harder a player tries to escape the slump, the more pressure can build. That's why the environment around Guerrero matters. If every at-bat becomes a referendum on his $500 million contract, the pressure only increases. If every strikeout becomes another headline, the noise gets louder. If every difficult series turns into another debate about whether the contract was justified, it becomes harder to focus on the actual baseball. The Blue Jays have to help remove some of that noise. They need Guerrero thinking about baseball, see the pitch, trust the swing, stay aggressive, compete, and move on to the next at-bat. That's easier said than done, but that's where teammates, coaches, and leadership matter. Toronto has already shown signs of life. There is another reason this situation is so interesting. The Blue Jays have not simply collapsed. They have shown signs of life. They have had stretches where they have played good baseball. They have found ways to win games. And they have made moves designed to improve their chances. That matters. Because if Toronto were completely out of the picture, the conversation would be different. Instead, the team is still trying to position itself for the postseason. That means every game matters. Every series matters. Every pitching matchup matters. Every offensive opportunity matters. And that puts additional importance on Guerrero's bat. Not because he has to save the franchise, but because a productive Guerrero makes the entire team more dangerous. The trade deadline changes the picture. Toronto also shook up its roster around the trade deadline. That's an important part of this story. The Blue Jays understood that the existing roster had weaknesses. They needed more depth. They needed players capable of contributing immediately. And they needed to think beyond one individual position. When a team makes moves during the season, the objective is usually straightforward. Improve the roster, create more options, increase depth, give the manager more ways to win. But trades don't automatically solve everything. New players have to adjust. Teammates have to develop chemistry. Roles can change. And the team still has to execute. That's why the Blue Jays' current stretch is so important. The roster may look different, the opportunities may look different, but ultimately the players still have to perform. Guerrero doesn't need to be perfect. There is another important point. Guerrero does not need to become perfect overnight. He doesn't need to transform into a completely different player. He doesn't need to hit a home run every night. He doesn't need to carry the team through every series. What Toronto needs is a more confident version of its superstar. A player who trusts his approach. A player who doesn't chase results. A player who stays within himself. A player who understands that one bad at-bat does not define the next one. That sounds simple, but at the major league level, that mental approach can be extremely difficult, especially when the expectations are enormous, especially when the contract is enormous, especially when every game matters. The $500 million contract. Let's talk about the contract because there is no escaping it. A 14-year, $500 million deal automatically changes the conversation. It creates a level of expectation that few players ever experience. But a contract is not a guarantee that a player will dominate every season. Baseball doesn't work that way. Even the best players have difficult stretches. Even MVP-caliber hitters can struggle. Even franchise icons can experience seasons where the numbers don't match expectations. The real question is what happens over the life of the contract. And Guerrero has plenty of time to write the next chapters of his career. That's why the Blue Jays should avoid turning one difficult season into a permanent judgment. The organization committed to Guerrero because it believes in his long-term ability. Now the job is to create the environment where that talent can consistently show up. What happens if Guerrero gets hot? This is where things become really interesting. Imagine the Blue Jays entering the final stretch of the season with Guerrero suddenly locked in. Imagine him hitting the ball hard. Imagine him driving runners home. Imagine him reaching base consistently. Imagine opposing pitchers having to change their approach because they don't want to make a mistake to Toronto's biggest star. Now combine that with healthier pitching. Suddenly, Toronto becomes much more dangerous. That's the upside. And it's why the Blue Jays should not panic. The season isn't decided by one difficult stretch. The team has an opportunity to improve. The question is whether it can do so quickly enough. The Blue Jays need a complete team. Toronto cannot depend on one player. That's the biggest lesson here. If Guerrero hits .300 and the pitching collapses, Toronto still has a problem. If the pitching staff dominates but the offense disappears, Toronto still has a problem. If the bullpen struggles, the starters cannot carry everything. If the lineup becomes too dependent on one or two hitters, opposing teams can exploit that weakness. The Blue Jays need balance. They need contributions from multiple players. They need depth. They need health. They need consistency. And most importantly, they need to play with urgency without playing with panic. That's a difficult balance. The biggest question. So here's the question surrounding the Blue Jays right now. Can Toronto's supporting cast do enough to take pressure off Vladimir Guerrero Jr.? Because if the answer is yes, the entire situation changes. Guerrero doesn't need to be perfect. He just needs to become productive. And the rest of the team needs to do its part. The pitching staff needs to stabilize. The bullpen needs to stay competitive. The defense needs to make routine plays. The supporting hitters need to contribute. And the coaching staff needs to put players in situations where they can succeed. If that happens, Toronto has a chance. If it doesn't, the Blue Jays could find themselves watching the postseason from home. So where does that leave the Toronto Blue Jays? It leaves them with a challenge. but it also leaves them with a chance. The pitching staff has taken serious hits, and that problem isn't going away simply because one hitter gets hot. The Blue Jays have to find ways to survive those injuries. They have to get contributions from across the roster. They have to maximize every healthy arm. And they have to continue competing in a crowded playoff race. But at the same time, the organization cannot afford to treat Vladimir Guerrero Jr. like he is the problem. He is part of the solution. He is one of the most important pieces of the solution. And if Toronto can help him rediscover the confidence and swagger that made him so dangerous, the entire team could benefit. Guerrero doesn't have to hit 50 home runs. He doesn't have to win every game. He doesn't have to carry the entire franchise. He simply needs to become the player who makes opponents nervous again, the player who steps into the batter's box and makes everyone wonder what could happen next. Because that's what a superstar does. And that's why Toronto invested $500 million in him. The Blue Jays need their star. But more importantly, their star needs his team. The clubhouse needs to rally around him. The pitching staff needs to fight through its challenges. The supporting cast needs to produce. And the coaching staff needs to keep the group focused. If all of those pieces begin moving in the same direction, Toronto could still make this season very interesting. But if the Blue Jays continue relying on individual performances to cover up team-wide problems, the playoff race could slip away. That's the reality facing Toronto. The pitching situation is serious. Guerrero's struggles are significant. But neither problem has to define the season. The Blue Jays still have time. They still have talent. And they still have a superstar capable of changing a game. Now they need to put everything together, because October baseball doesn't wait for anyone. And if Toronto wants to return to the Fall Classic, the time to find its identity is right now. What do you think? Can Vladimir Guerrero Jr. turn things around and become the superstar Toronto needs during the final stretch of the season? Or is the Blue Jays pitching situation simply too big of a problem to overcome? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this Blue Jays update, make sure to subscribe for more Toronto Blue Jays news, MLB updates, roster developments, injuries, and playoff race coverage. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.